Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about implied consent laws. I'm going to explain to you what they are, how they operate, and why you need to know what they are. Because these laws, they sound a little strange, implied consent, but they apply in every state in the Union in the United States of America. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. My name is Joe Pometto. I'm your host. This is Joe the Lawyer. I'm a practicing attorney out of Pittsburgh, PA. I primarily do criminal defense, but also family law, personal injury, and other civil litigation. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. It is a free way to support the show. I truly appreciate it. It will help me get more views. It will feed the YouTube the YouTube algorithm and help me grow my channel, which is what I want to do so I can keep bringing more quality content and information to my viewers out there. Now, before we dig into implied consent laws, everybody raise your glass in the air. Take a sip with me. I got some iced tea here. It tastes better when we sip together. Cheers. Okay, what is an implied consent law? Well, first of all, they sound almost paradoxical, right? It doesn't make sense. Consent is generally something that is given by someone voluntarily, right? So for instance, if you say to the police, I'm going to allow you to search my vehicle, or, in the wake of the Me Too movement in years past, consent for some type of kiss or sexual activity, right? Consent is something that we see as voluntary, that is given by a person of their own free will. Now, but when something's implied, it's saying that it wasn't necessarily given by free will, right? If something is implied, then we are saying that something is assumed or is put onto someone without actions being taken or without certain caveats that we usually think about. So how can consent be implied? Well, the way the law looks at it is that consent can be implied through actions, through a person undertaking certain things or certain activities. And today, the activity that we are going to talk about is driving a vehicle. And one of the reasons I'm making this video is one of my an older video I made about DUIs has gone, semi-viral. So I'm assuming that people want to hear more about this. So I'm going to bring more of what the people want. Let's talk about DUIs and implied consent laws. So essentially what an implied consent law, and these laws exist in all 50 states, United States of America. What it says is, if you get in a vehicle, if you get in a car or a truck or a motorcycle and you drive on public roads anywhere in these 50 states, because all 50 states have it, okay, you just by virtue of getting behind the wheel and driving your vehicle on a public road, you have already consented to giving a blood or a breath sample if the police have pulled you over or if they have reason to suspect you have been drinking and driving, or you are driving under the influence. So let me say that again, just by the very act of driving on a public road. And that's an important piece, because this is something else that we could talk about perhaps in a separate video. But public, you can actually drink and drive. DUI laws, one of the things that they rely upon is you driving on a public road. So you can actually drink and drive if you built your own racetrack in your own backyard and not get a DUI. Interesting, huh? So by virtue of getting on these public roads, you have consented to giving a blood or a breath sample as long as the police have reasonable suspicion to believe you have been driving under the influence. So if someone is pulled over, let's say the car is swerving, the police pull them over, and then the officer goes up and he's just going to give a ticket for crossing the line or running a red light or not using a turn signal. And then he talks to the individual and he smells alcohol, sees glossy eyes, slurred speech. Those are 3 classic indicators, by the way, that police will often cite when giving someone a DUI. If the police detect that, boom, that implied consent law is going to be activated. At that point in time, they have some clues, they have some facts, slurred speech, the smell of alcohol coming from the person's breath, glossy eyes. There's other things, other common ones that are cited, such as if a person is reaching for the glove box to get their insurance card and their hand shakes. I see that one all the time. Those are indicators the person may be intoxicated, inebriated, impaired, unable to drive, under the influence. That activates the implied consent statute. At that point, the way it works is the police officer can ask you if you will give a blood or a breath sample. Now, this is where the implied consent law comes into place. If the individual says no, refuses, and we call this a refusal in the legal parlance, if the individual says no, that they do not want to give a blood or a breath sample to the police, then they have violated that implied consent statute. They have violated the implied consent statute because, again, what the courts are saying, what the law is saying, is that you've already consented to give blood or breath in this situation. You're on a public road and the police have reasonable suspicion or clues to believe that you've been driving. At that point in time, they can ask, and if you say no, you are violating the law. You're violating the implied consent statute. Now, what happens if you violate these implied consent statutes? Well, in the great state of Pennsylvania, they will suspend your license for a year. And if you've had multiple DUIs or multiple refusals, violations of the implied consent statutes, you can get even greater penalty, greater license suspension, be 18 months, sometimes even longer. And you may be asking yourself, what makes this law, maybe you're not, but you should be, what makes this law constitutional? Why is this constitutional? And the courts and the appeals courts, and I believe the United States Supreme Court, have said they are constitutional because what these laws are doing is they're not punishing you criminally. They're not punishing you criminally for refusing, although in certain instances the refusal can allow a greater criminal punishment. But the implied consent statute specifically is a civil punishment. It's a civil punishment. A license suspension is a civil punishment. So that is something that you need to be aware of if you're driving on the roads or if you are under suspicion of DUI, and let's hope that you're not. If you refuse the blood or breath test and the police have reasonable suspicion to believe that you've been driving, you will get hit with an extra license suspension. And in most instances, you're going to have to then contend with a DUI charge, plus you're going to have to contend with the license suspension. Now, one more thing to clear up about this. When the police, at least in Pennsylvania, when the police want to activate these implied consent laws, they have to give what are called O'Connell warnings. So let's say you're driving on the road, they get public road, pulled over, police have the clues to suspect a DUI. They then have to give you the proper warnings in order to activate the law. And these, under Pennsylvania law, are called O'Connell warnings. And it includes informing the individual of the blood test or the breath test that the police are requesting, basically why they are requesting it, and that it could result in a license suspension. If the police, law enforcement, has fulfilled those O'Connell warnings, pretty much anything the individual does at that point, besides saying, yes, I'll give the blood or I'll give the breath, will be deemed a refusal and a violation of the implied consent law. What do I mean by that? Well, if the police ask you and you say, I want to talk to my lawyer before I do this, boom, you violated implied consent. You're not going to be able to fight it in court. If the police say, I want your blood or breath, and you say, I'm scared of needles, I'm not going to do it, boom, you violated the implied consent law. If you just sit there silently and stare off into space and don't answer them or indicate your agreement to give the test, then that will be deemed a refusal. So they're tricky. They're very hard to get around, and if you make the refusal, you are going to get hit with an extra license suspension. Now, there's a couple other twists to this, such as is it ever a good idea to refuse the blood or the breath test? Let me just say this much: rarely is a good idea to do that, because you are going to get a much larger license suspension if you refuse the test. Now, if an individual has a really, really bad record, and they're facing a really tough situation where they're being asked to give breath or blood, it may sometimes be in the best interest for them to refuse it. But what I'm telling you is the vast majority of the time, and you know, don't take straight up advice from your YouTube lawyer, okay? And keep in mind that every single state is different. It's usually a good idea to go ahead and give the blood or the breath, because things can get much worse if you don't. Now, there's one other principle here. It's called consciousness of guilt. I'm going to talk about it in my next video. But I hope you found this informative. Now you are aware, if you refuse a blood or breath test, there are consequences to it if and when a person has been driving and they're under the influence. And actually, here's the funny thing. There's consequences to it even if you're not under the influence. You can still be deemed to have violated the implied consent law if the police gave the O'Connell warnings and had reasonable suspicion for suspecting that there was a DUI. So you can still end up with a license suspension even if you haven't been drinking. So keep that in mind. I hope you found this interesting, the implied consent laws, and there have been constitutional challenges. They've been deemed to be constitutional. But I hope you found this interesting. You learned something today about the law, maybe made you a little curious. In the next video, I'm going to talk about a concept in the law. It's called consciousness of guilt, which ties directly into this. If you like my videos, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. My name is Joe Pometto, Joe the lawyer. I'm here to inform people and talk about the laws. I am not giving legal advice. Again, like, subscribe, comment, and share. Thank you, everybody. Have a tremendous day.